Welcome everybody. Today we're talking about surviving and thriving with virtual learning, practical strategies at home that can make virtual learning work for you. I'm your host, Dolin. I'm a former Fairfax County public school teacher. I'm the author of 3 books, and for the last 22 years, I've been the president of Educational Connections Tutoring. I started Educational Connections actually as a side job. When I was a teacher, I would travel to kids' homes after school and tutor them, and I found that over time that was my calling in life. So I ended up quitting my job and starting my business with just one student sitting at my dining room table. And over the years, it has grown quite a lot. It's actually an unprecedented time now. Since March, our model was working side by side with kids, but now it's all virtual. So I'll talk a little bit about that later, and really how we as parents can make virtual learning easier for our kids. So I'm going to talk for about a half hour today, and then I will open it up to Q&A. If you have questions throughout our time together, feel free to pop them into the Q&A feature on your Zoom toolbar. You can also put a note in chat if you'd like. I've prepared an ebook for everyone today, and the ebook is about 14 pages long, and I think it's really helpful to help parents navigate virtual learning. It's called 6 Tips for Smoother at-Home Learning, even when you're dreading it. And you can get it easily by texting the word virtual to 55444, and it will be delivered right to your inbox. All right, so curious, before we start, what is the age of your child or your children? If you could just type that into the chat feature right now, I would love to know, because that would help me further fine-tune the presentation today if I have a better understanding of what the ages are of your kids. Okay, so somebody said 14, 8 and 9, 12, 11, 8 and 17, 14, 13 and 8th grader, and 15 a sophomore, 9, 14, 14 and 16, 15, 19 and 20, 15 and 13, 8, 15 and 16. All right, interesting. A lot of high school students, so that's great. And we also have some elementary and middle school students as well. So I'll make sure that I really address all of the ages of the kids that you came to learn about today. We'll talk about 3 major things. One is really setting up a great workspace for our kids. Whether today is your first day at school, your child has been in school for a couple of weeks or hasn't started yet, we'll talk about really the 2 ways to set up that really terrific workspace that's going to work for you and work for them. And of course, along the way, we'll discuss how kids can be most focused in their workspace. Secondly, we'll discuss routines, structure. Really, this is the backbone of how this is going to work day in and day out. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, we'll discuss relationships with our kids, especially as we're working from home, because we all know that's not always easy. So here's how it looked in March. This is the traditional school model. Our teacher was standing in the front of the class instructing our kids, and she knew when they were doing a good job or when they needed a little bit more help. She knew when they were on task or off task, and she could walk around the room and make sure they were focused. But here's our new reality. It's very different. Here's our teacher in a Zoom room of 25 or 30 kids. It's tough on teachers, it's tough on kids, and it's tough on us, mostly because it feels like instruction is not as personal as it was even earlier this year. So what can we do at home to make this easier for our kids? And the first thing we can do is really to make our home ripe for learning. And we can do that by setting up the ideal workspace. Now, there's a couple ways we can do it. The first one, which you may have already done, is to set up an individual desk for your child. And it doesn't have to be, an expensive desk that you buy from IKEA or Wayfair. It can just be an old card table you drag up from the basement. But really, it's your child's own space that they make as their own. It should be quiet, but not too quiet. So for elementary students, ideally, it's going to be within earshot of you. So if you're working in your home office or in a place in your living room, maybe your child is in the kitchen or the dining room. So you can kind of keep an eye on them, but you're not right on top of them. As kids get older, they're gonna want more privacy. It's just what happens in our child's development. And as we see, many students will say, can I set up this space in my bedroom? And for most kids, especially elementary and middle school kids, it's not ideal. The reason is the bedroom is inherently distracting. And we want to make sure as parents that our kids get off on the right foot when they start school. So really, if they earn that privilege, that's often better for younger kids. If we make sure that they're on task, they're following through with their work, and they're overall doing a good job, that's when maybe you can grant them more privileges. But off the bat, I'd say, especially for younger students, the bedroom is not the ideal place. Now, here's the second option. This is when you might have multiple kids or a smaller space. And the reality is they're gonna have to share a workstation. So you might fashion your dining room table or your kitchen table into your virtual school workspace. And you can actually do that quite easily, but kids do need a visual divider. You can go to Michael's or a craft store and buy one of those 3-panel science fair project displays, just like Paige has here. And you'll see that she even has her schedule on the right-hand side, which I'll talk about in a second. But she's made this her own little station. Or you could go on to Lakeshore Learning or Really Good Stuff. Target has them too. And find testing carrel dividers that are used in schools. Really any way you want to set it up so that kids have a barrier when you have multiple kids working together is ideal for the second option. Now, along the way, we're going to want to make sure our kids are equipped for success. This sounds like something that's super basic, but we found in working with lots of kids in the spring, they didn't always have a stable Wi-Fi connection. They were in and they were out. So make sure wherever you put this space for your child that there's really great Wi-Fi throughout the day. Make sure your child has a really comfortable chair, which may not be your dining room chair. It may not even be an office chair. For some really fidgety kids, it might be something unique, like a ball chair. We want to make sure our students have noise-canceling earphones so they can hear their teacher and their peers and block out extraneous noise. It's also the case that if you have multiple kids learning at one space, when a child is talking, they may need a separate space to move during that part of the day. Kids need a way to write down their assignments. This is non-negotiable. Maybe it's a paper and pencil assignment book or a planner like this one I found on Amazon. It could be something electronic. Older kids are much better about keeping things in Google Notes or on their calendar, somewhere in Google Classroom to keep track of their assignments. They just need a way to do it. And then lastly, kids need to keep track of time. And this sounds obvious, but one of the things we often see in our kids that have executive function weaknesses or ADHD, they're not always aware of time. There's research that shows that when kids have an analog clock, it really helps them understand elapsed time and how much more time they have. So if you have an analog clock somewhere else in your house, pull it out and put it in your child's study area so that they can help with their time, so it can help with their time management skills. Other things that are helpful, definitely not mandatory, but I think they're great for kids. The first is an accordion binder. I used to tell parents, make sure your child has something like a trapper keeper with 3 rings so they can hole punch and file if necessary, but also the accordion part. I often, for high school kids, would get kids to buy multiple 3-ring binders. But the reality is now there's not a ton of paper flow. Most things are electronic, but when they do get papers, they need a place to put them that's organized. I love the accordion binder. Kids have found them to be super helpful. And they're really easy to use. Obviously, each tab is labeled with a subject. And when your child gets a paper, they put it in the back of that section. Thereby, everything is chronologically organized. Also, something basic but can really make a difference is just having a Post-it note or a 3x5 card with the websites your child has to visit throughout the day, their username and password. And then, nice to haves as well. I love highlighters for kids. I especially like erasable highlighters. Kids enjoy using these because if they know something's important to learn and then they've practiced it, they can go back and erase it. Same with erasable colored pencils. And I'll tell you why I love those so much in just a moment. So, next question, and please utilize the chat. Is focus an issue for your child? Yes, no, or sometimes. Is focus an issue for your child? Please put it in the chat. Yes. Sometimes, yes, 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 definitely. Yes, yes, with lots of exclamation points. Yes, in all capitals, sometimes. All right, awesome. Yes, my child has ADHD. Okay, got it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about focus and dive deeper into that. What we saw in the spring with lots of kids that we worked with, and you know, parents called our office all the time looking for help for their kids, especially now. But in the spring, what we saw is parents were saying things like, they can't do virtual learning. They're so distracted. They cannot focus. They're completely unmotivated. And when we started working with these kids one-to-one online, we found that actually for the vast majority of the kids, that wasn't the case at all. And it was very different. Some of these kids we had worked with for a long time before that, and we actually found they were more attentive on Zoom because we were able to annotate papers and use lots of colors and share worksheets together, marking up everything, and it was lots of fun. And it occurred to me as time went on that it wasn't really the medium of virtual learning. It was just that the room with all these kids felt very depersonalized to our students. And that's what they were struggling with the most, more than anything. But the reality was they still had to do it. So along the way, we found some strategies that really worked for kids. And the first thing I would say is that when kids are in a room where the teacher is delivering instruction with lots of kids, it's really hard for them to focus on what she's saying and what she's doing, whether she's giving a lecture, going through a PowerPoint, whatever. So let's talk a little bit about what to do in that case. You know, one thing that I found and our tutors found really worked well for kids is making sure they had a fidget toy nearby. It can be something so simple as this mesh bag with a marble that kids move back and forth with their fingers. I wish I invented it. It's such a simple thing, but kids love them. And this is actually the best-selling fidget toy on Amazon. We grew up with Silly Putty, but the modern day Silly Putty, which is a great fidget toy for kids, is called Neato. We know fidget spinners. These are great for kids, wiggle feet, sensory cushions, great for kids that have difficulty sitting still. We also found that when kids use timers, just like what we taught them to do before virtual learning, they had far more success. Oftentimes, the kids met with their teacher, but then the teacher would give them activities to do. And that's really the case now too. They're not all in synchronous learning all the time. This is especially true now where we have kids that have been in school for a couple of weeks and the teachers have planning time. And it's you know, a few hours and they have to do their work. They had a hard time getting started. So, you know, if you've heard me speak before, you know I love timers. We've used them for kids from kindergarten to college. But I like them for procrastination because if you're really having a hard time getting started, you want to set it for something super short. So you can take your age +1. Like a 10-year-old, you just set it for 11 minutes. And we share with kids, you say to yourself, I want to work as hard as I can, as best as I can, focus as much as I can, just for 11 minutes. And when the timer goes off, I can keep on going or I can take a break. Typically, they can keep on going. When they have to get something larger done, it's not necessarily an issue with procrastination, but they know they need to have an essay done or something bigger. And it's not that they can't get started, it's just that it feels overwhelming. We have them set the timer for 25 minutes. There's research, actually you can look it up, called the Pomodoro technique that shows that really 25 minutes is the sweet spot for individuals. Anything more is too long, you lose focus, you're unmotivated. Anything less, you may not get the entire task done. So we'll have kids set it for 25 minutes and work as hard and best they can during that time. Other things we found to be helpful. Instead of kids taking notes on a blank sheet, which is generally what they've done in the past, they've had a lined sheet of notebook paper to take notes. We found that doodle notes are much more successful for our students. These are like the modern day way of taking notes. And our brain thinks in sections, in categories. So when a teacher is sharing information, kids will take the framework of one of these doodle notes, and at the bottom right, you can see a couple of ones that have not been filled in by kids, and they can jot down what they need to know. They can jot down chunks of information, vocabulary words, whatever it is. And then when they're done, they can go back and draw pictures, color it in meaningful ways. And we found that it is this act of making it their own, making it colorful and interesting and attractive, that gets them to go back later and study from it instead of just taking notes and not using them again. Other things that can help with focus: be sure kids have all their unnecessary windows closed out before they start in the morning. Ideally, if we can get them to do it, especially if they're younger and we can, the phone should be in another room, not next to them the whole time. And if you found in your family that really technology is your biggest issue and kids are having a hard time controlling their usage, many families have found Google Family Link to be very successful. And Google Family Link allows you access to your child's phone. You sit down with your child, they have to give you permission, and together you can put limits on certain applications, like the Disney website, or it could be YouTube, whatever it might be, so that there's clear usage time. And in addition, you can make sure that it's not used at certain times of the day. So ideally, whatever we do, whether we want to set up our child's workspace, get them a couple of fidget toys, or make sure their media use is acceptable, we want to get our child's buy-in. It's far better to say, hey, let's talk about a couple of ways you can get set up. Let's talk about which one might work for you. Or you might like this, you might not. Let's talk about it. So before you run out and buy fidget toys, ask your child, are there any here that you think might be helpful? And often getting kids buy-in at first helps them to utilize the strategy later on. So let's talk a little bit about routines and structures. As I mentioned, this is kind of like the backbone for our day-to-day way of living. Our kids do better with routines, especially if that does not come naturally to them. If your child has difficulty with attention, has ADHD, executive function weaknesses, this is critical. Routines allow kids to know what to expect. They know what's happening next. And when they know what's happening next, they're more likely to fall into rhythm and follow through on what we want them to do. It's kind of like having the whole family on autopilot instead of, oh shoot, I forgot we have this next. It's always there. That routine is printed out so kids know what's coming up. So how do we make this a reality? One of the things that I found is that talking to kids about what can work with them is really better than coming up with this routine that you type out, put in writing, and say to your kids, all right, this is what we're going to do this year. You might even start out with something as simple as the morning routine and getting up out of bed, because this is really important right now. It's probably more important than what time kids go to bed, because they have a pain point in the morning. They have to get up and be online, so they're more likely to follow through. I like using the magic words, I've noticed. So you can say something like, I've noticed we tend to do better with routines, where things are the same day in and day out. I like I've noticed because it's not passing judgment on the child. And we're not saying something like, you do better with routines. If you don't have a routine, it just doesn't go well. That feels kind of negative. So you might ask the question, based on what you know about yourself, what would be a good time to get up each morning? And you might ask, about how long do you need to do this? How about that? And that way you're hashing it out with your kids, so you create a routine that everybody has buy-in to. We want to avoid why questions. Why questions often put kids on the defensive and can create some friction. So if we say to our kids, why can't you get up on time? Why didn't you get up when the alarm clock went off? Those questions are hard for kids because it's like a big thing to process. They don't always know why. But if you say something like a what question, what would help you to get up in the morning, that often elicits a better response. So in addition to talking about the up and out schedule, or I should say up and ready, I guess our kids aren't going out these days, we want to really talk about the daily schedule. This is something that should be printed out every day, or what we often do with our kids is we'll have them write the schedule out so they have it on their in their area each morning. The schedule is key. Kids, again, need to know what's coming up next. And when they have that in front of them, they can cross off their classes as they go along. So as parents, we want to say, oh, tell me about your day. What do you have first? Tell me about what's after that. How do you want to, what do you think you might do during your break time today? Having that discussion each morning, even if it's for 2 minutes, really helps kids to start thinking ahead, which they may not otherwise do. So the breaks are important. Breaks, we often think, oh, phew, a break, that's great. But many of our kids will automatically stay at their computer and go onto a game. Or they might go into the family room and start playing Xbox. Their natural inclination is to go back to a screen. And really during breaks, we want to be careful with screens. Ideally, our kids are up and out and doing some kind of movement activity. But here's the thing. Activities, screen time that's hard to stop can often seem addicting to kids. And these types of activities like video games, YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, they produce lots of dopamine in the brain. And when kids have tons of dopamine, their receiving neurons expect more dopamine. And so when we say, put that down, you have a class now, they don't want to. And they have a hard time because their brain is telling them, don't stop. And so it's super hard for them to shift gears, and they're often irritable. So for that reason, we don't want them to engage in these type of activities, ideally during breaks. Instead, they can get low dopamine through other activities that are not quite addicting, like riding their bikes, arts and crafts, maybe playing with friends or building with blocks. It could be even reading an ebook. That type of screen time is okay, but just not a highly interactive game that feels addicting. Ideally on breaks, we also want our kids to connect with others, that they have something to look forward to, maybe a lunch with their friends in person or online. Perhaps during downtime, especially that teacher workday on Mondays, if you live in Fairfax County, in some districts it's Wednesday afternoons, they can study virtually or together in person, depending on your comfort level. So we talked about touching base with our kids first thing in the morning before they start on their day, but also I found just checking in weekly is vital. Weekly is helpful because we can help our kids look ahead. So we might say, oh, let's open up Google Calendar. Tell me, what do you have coming up this week? Do you have any big projects or tests? Maybe you can say, what are your priorities for the week? What's the number one thing you want to get done? You could ask about extracurriculars. You might want to say, oh, remember hockey practice on Wednesday this week. Those types of discussions are helpful to get kids' executive functioning skills fired up. So they're looking at the week ahead instead of just in the moment or just at the day, on that day. And if you're a parent that wants to know about grades, this is a time when you can ask, do you want to look at your grade portal together? If you do, I would recommend doing this with your child and not when your child isn't with you. The reason is, if you see a missing assignment, it's easy to assume they just didn't know about it or just didn't care enough to turn it in. But there could be another reason. So talking to your child in a non-confrontational, non-judgmental way when they're with you, checking their grades or their homework portal is really ideal. And then lastly, and number 3, we want to preserve our relationships with our kids. It's probably the most important things we can do so that kids keep in touch with their friends, kids have good relationships with their teachers, and of course, we have good relationships with our own children. So I'd love to talk about our next topic, which is working from home. A question for you, and please put it in the chat. Are your kids able to be independent with virtual school? So if you're working from home and your kids are online, can they do it independently? Yes, no, or maybe. When mom said yes, sometimes, yes, no, one yes and one no. For the most part, but not 100%. Maybe. Well, this sounds really positive. When mom says needs lots of reminders for the next Zoom. All right, thank you for that, everybody. Great. One Jennifer said one yes and one no. All right, so let's talk about that because it can be tricky. So I mentioned having that schedule out first thing. It's really important that kids know what's going on if you're working from home. They should also, if you have the luxury of having another adult in the house, know who their go-to person is. So you might say, look, I'm your go-to person from 9 to 10, and dad's your go-to person from 10 to 11. So if you need help, that's who you come to. If you decide to do that, it should be in writing, because if you say that to your child, it's going to be in one ear and out the other, and kids will completely forget about it, and they'll come to you when you're in the middle of something. I found that a visual is almost always better than a verbal. So put it on a whiteboard, but make sure it's in your child's study area so they can see. I found great success, or our tutors have actually, with those big pieces of poster, they're not poster board, they're like paper that are sticky and can stick onto a wall. We've worked with kids putting reminders. We've done lots of activities with them where they're up and out of their chairs and they're writing main ideas, all kinds of fun things with them. But you can use it for just notes to your kids, and it's big so they can see it. You can also use visuals if you need to get something done and you need to have interrupted time because perhaps you've got a report due and you have to get it done. Or maybe you're on a conference call and you cannot be disturbed. You can use the red and green light approach. You know, just like a stoplight, red means stop, green means come on in, go. So for our kids, we can take 2 colors of construction paper. And if we have a home office, we can put red on the door, which means I can't be disturbed. I'm in the middle of something really important. We can put green up, which means open door, come see me, I'm available to you. If we want to get fancy, we can use yellow too. And a yellow means if you really need me, come in and I can help you. It doesn't have to be construction paper. It can be any visual. It can be cups. It can be Sharpie notes. But here's the thing. If you want to do this with your kids, it won't work if you say, okay, you guys, look, today we're going to try something new. If I have a red piece of paper, this is what's going to happen. No, you're going to have to come up with different scenarios for your kids. And you might say to them, all right, let's pretend I have red on the door. And now you guys are arguing because Molly's volume on her computer is too loud. What do you do? And you play it out. You can do it for lots of situations. And that's super fun for kids, actually. So that practice helps them to be able to execute it in the future. But lastly, the main thing that we can do for our students at a time when everything feels so stressful is to focus on completion and not quality. It's our job as parents to make sure that our kids are online, they're up out of bed, they're in front of their computer, they're online on time, and they're ready to go. We want to make sure they're connected with their teachers before we walk away. We might check in on them throughout the day, make sure they're doing okay, but ideally, we're focused on making sure their work is done, not on whether they spell the words correctly, their math problems are right, if they have enough adjectives in their sentences. That stuff doesn't matter. Leave the quality to the teacher and you just focus on completion. That eliminates half the battles right then and there. For older kids, we can't micromanage their work. It just can't happen because they're too old and they're too independent and they want to be that way. But we may have to negotiate things with them. I love the blind eye strategy. We might say something like, look, I'm willing to turn a blind eye with you watching Netflix late at night if you're willing to do these two things every day. And maybe those two things are getting up on time and being ready for their first class on time. So there's some give and take. There's some push and pull. So I like blind eye strategy. But overall, it feels like we're spending so much time with our kids, and we're with them 7 days a week. We also want to make time for just doing things together that aren't related to academics, like family dinners. I love the website, thefamilydinnerproject.org. It's awesome. It has lots of conversation starters for kids of all ages. But I like it because it's a way of talking to kids that doesn't involve academics. I like having a time when we don't ask about grades. We don't ask about them finishing an assignment or what they did in science. It's really about just bonding as a family together and spending time together, even if it's just a couple of days per week. So ultimately, we want to make sure that our kids are ready to go, but they're also connected with teachers, even our reserve students. And we've found since March, this has been a real issue for students. When we talk to parents on the phone, when they call our office, they often say, my child won't advocate for themselves. He's really embarrassed even to have his video on. He won't have his audio on. He won't ask for help no matter what I do. So we've found a lot of success with helping kids do little things like raising their hand, private messaging their teachers. So if you can help your child just do one thing that elicits a positive response from their teacher, even if it's in private, they're more likely to do it again in the future. If the teacher likes email, help your child write an email to the teacher. You might say something like, "Hi, Mrs. Smith, I'm really having difficulty reducing fractions. I'm stuck on number 4. Could I talk to you about this after class today?" Because if the teacher writes back something positive, which she most likely will, now your child is going to have an in, and they're more likely to do it in the future. If you're stuck on content, and maybe your child feels like the teacher isn't explaining it as well. We see this often in high school students. Find a college student or somebody else to help if you feel like it's over your head. Hire a professional, which was what we do. We help kids with executive functioning skills and subjects. But you might ultimately find that sometimes your child needs help and sometimes it's just a passing thing. So here's how to know if your child needs help. If they're struggling with executive functions, they're disorganized, they're having a hard time keeping track of things. They often do things very last minute and it all feels stressful. If there's lots of friction in the relationship between you and your child, and when you push, your child pushes back really hard, that's a sign that bringing somebody else in is really the antidote. And then lastly, you want to be careful with kids in cumulative subjects like math. If your child feels like she's behind and she's really having a hard time, no amount of just pay attention or work harder is going to help in a cumulative subject. And that's because one skill builds upon another. So get help from the teacher or somebody else if you find that your child is really in a rut with math, a math-based science, or a foreign language. So at the end of the day, we want to do 3 things to help our kids get started. We want to make sure that they have a designated workspace set up. We want to make sure their daily schedule is printed out, and we spend time once a week talking about their week ahead. And then lastly, we want to preserve relationships, focusing on getting stuff done, completion over quality. So if you joined me a little bit late, I wanted to mention that I've compiled an ebook for you. It's about 14 pages of information on smoother at-home learning, even if you're dreading it. And you can get that easily by just texting virtual to the number 55444. So I hope this was helpful to everyone, and I would love to answer your questions right now. So let's see, if you have a question, even if you typed it in the chat earlier, if you could either put it in the chat or put it in the Q&A right now, it may have gotten lost in the chat. That would be fabulous. Okay, so I'll go back to some that I see here. And one mom said, is there a way to buy these dividers affordably And she said, I've seen some really cool ones, but they're sold in bundles. And yes, I've seen that too. Like you buy them in 6-packs and they're like $48. You can certainly do that because I found that kids will go through multiple ones. You know, they'll decorate it a certain way and then a few weeks later they'll start a new one, and they like doing that. So if you have a child who's artistic, you might just want to buy a bunch of them. But if not, just go up to Michael's and find one of the science, they're in the cardboard dividers section, like the science project area. And that's not what it's called, but I think you know what I mean, where they have the poster boards. And see if you can find the one with 3 panels. That works just as well, and you can buy those individually. All right, so, oh, sorry, she said the doodle notes and not the dividers being affordable. Yes, go to Teachers Pay Teachers. I love that website, by the way. And then if you type in free doodle notes, you can find them for free and you don't have to buy them in bulk. Sorry, Cynthia, I answered the wrong question. All right, so let's see. How do you motivate an elementary school child to try their hardest? You know, as parents, it's honestly really hard to flip the switch to learning and to, you know, take a kid that is just willing to do what he needs to do to get by and make them a super motivated learner. I haven't really found the secret to that, but what I have found is that as parents, we can make the environment right for motivation. And that means we can make sure that they're set up in a space that works for them. We can praise their effort. So even if we see that they're not putting forth effort, but one time we see they wrote a couple of great spelling sentences, we praise their effort, not how smart they are, but wow, I can tell, you know, you really worked hard on those sentences. I love number 2. You have so many adjectives. What a great idea. So anytime we can praise effort over intelligence, research tells us that that's really the motivating factor, not saying something like, you know what, you're just as smart as your sister, or I know you're smart and you're capable, you can do that. That actually tends to demotivate kids. So I hope that helps. And also, just to share something interesting with you, I remember when my older son, who's now 22, I think he was in 8th grade, and he was sitting on the couch when I came home from work one day, and he's just sitting there with this calculator, no workout. And I said, oh, what are you working on? And he said, oh, I'm trying to figure out what the lowest grade I can get on my math test is and still get a B in algebra. And it just drove me nuts at the time, because I'm like, oh, you know, if you just cared more and put in the time to get the A, you know, but he was super strategic. And I found that a lot of kids, they're strategic. They're only willing to put in as much effort as they need to. Later in life, that will serve them well. But if we're high achievers as parents and they're different from us, it could just be that. And when they find what they love to do, they will flip the switch. But at this point, for many of our students, it's not always what we want. It's going to be something different later on when they find it. Okay, and thank you for that question. All right, so I think that's all the questions we have right now. Anybody else have a question that I can answer? I don't see one, but I've also left my email here. So if you have something that you want to ask me privately, I'm fast on email and I'll make sure I send you a response right away. So thank you all so much for being here today. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Before you leave, I just ask you a favor. I'm wondering if in the chat, you can tell me what your best takeaway is. Something that you learned today that you think can be helpful to you going forward. If you can just type that in the chat, and you can send it to everybody, it just doesn't have to be to panelists, that would be helpful. What's your takeaway? What's your takeaway that you learned today? Thank you. Let's see what folks say. Thank you, Allison. This has been fantastic. I appreciate it. Doodle notes in the accordion folder. That's a great idea. Excellent. Sherry, thank you for sharing that. I love the accordion folder. I make sure that we always make sure our students have one. Thank you so much. I love the doodle notes, and I like the family dinner project. Thanks, Christine. Excellent. Somebody said, I like the doodle notes because I don't take notes in a linear way as an adult. Somebody said, I've noticed, opposed to you don't have routines. Yes, I've noticed they're kind of like magic words. Providing a separate space for when they need to talk and emphasizing it needs to be quiet for everybody else. It's been really loud in our house, LOL, for sure. My mom said, I'm going to share the family dinner project with families in my neighborhood. I like the conversation starter as blind eye and not using why. Thank you, Tiffany. Yes, using why is tough for kids. Making a plan for break time. What do you think you want to do on your breaks today? Thanks, Jennifer, for that. Excellent. All right, terrific. It was really great to see all of you today. Thank you so much for participating. And we actually have a webinar coming up in 2 weeks. And that one is going to be different. It's really for kids that are already feeling a little bit disengaged. And it's called Zoomed Out, Ways to Keep Your Kids Motivated and Focused in a Virtual Learning Environment. So if that's your child and you're struggling early on, this would be a great webinar for you. Check our newsletters for it and we'll be sure it gets out to you. And again, feel free to text 55444 and the words virtual and the ebook will be on its way. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.